what I want to do is tell you what my premise is, and that is that supplementing gasoline with ethanol coupled with carbon capture and storage would actually increase climate damaging greenhouse gas emissions. And it would further pollute the water from Iowa to Louisiana, and it would divert needed funds away from real climate solutions in all the states that use the low carbon fuel standard and some of the provinces in Canada, as well as the Midwest. So the basic premise is this is not a good idea for a whole lot of reasons. And I'm going to mostly go through ethanol and focus on ethanol because that's where the big CO2 pipelines are proposed. With the, oh yeah, there's some fertilizer plants in the Midwest, and you heard about Project Tundra and some others, but the big pipeline networks are really proposed for ethanol in states like Minnesota and Iowa. So what are they saying? The producers of ethanol say that the substance generates less carbon than gasoline, but ethanol itself is 24% more carbon intensive than traditional fuel. So we're already starting out with a burden on the climate. And the reason that ethanol is so much more damaging than even gasoline alone is because it uses a nitrogen fertilizer to raise the corn for ethanol. And that increases the emissions of nitrous oxide, which is a hugely potent greenhouse gas. It's 289 times as powerful as CO2. So just the production of the corn means that we're already causing a climate burden. And we had heard from a prior speaker, Jeremy, about the parasitic load of carbon capture and storage. So carbon capture and storage requires this big machinery on top of an ethanol plant to capture the CO2 and then to compress it and to treat it. Different kind of processing than, say, the coal burning power plant, in part because the CO2 coming off an ethanol plant is so pure. It's about 97% CO2. But it still requires that extra energy to capture the carbon, pressurize it, put it through a pipeline. And as Jeremy said, it's called the parasitic load. It redirects electricity necessary, the electricity that's necessary for carbon capture and storage that could be used directly for the grid to power electric cars or otherwise decarbonize the energy system. So wind or solar, even if we use wind or solar for carbon capture and storage and use it to capture the CO2 from an ethanol plant, we could have used that directly to fuel an electric car. So we're using a clean energy source to produce a dirty energy source. And I think Maggie talked about enhanced oil recovery. And we have different figures for how much of the CO2 is currently captured. The range is about 73% to 90% is currently captured mostly from naturally occurring domes of CO2 in Texas, Colorado, New Mexico. And this is used for enhanced oil recovery. And I think of enhanced oil recovery really as fracking 2.0. And this negates any benefit of actually capturing the CO2 and sequestering it. It could be sequestered, but even that, as we've already seen, we're increasing the CO2 and greenhouse gases just from the carbon capture itself. But it continues the vicious cycle of using fossil fuel. My fifth point is that carbon capture and storage combined with gas-powered vehicles actually extends the use of the gas-powered vehicles. That's because ethanol is blended with gas. So what we're doing in the Midwest with growing corn for ethanol is that we're really producing gasoline on that land. So Mark Jacobson just came out with a wonderful study that we alluded to in that beautiful segue that we rehearsed for literally hours. And he did a big study on Summit's ethanol plan to say, you know, if we gave all the money that it looks like is going to go to Summit and we just put it into wind, what would the difference be in terms of carbon CO2? And he took two trucks. One was an electric Ford F-150, and that was electric, electric powered, and one is gas powered, and compared using ethanol and carbon capture and storage with just direct wind powered electricity for the two comparable pickup trucks. And he found that spending the money that we would spend on Summit on wind would avoid 2.4 to 4 times the CO2 emissions as spending the same funds on ethanol. So we just get this big, win with wind. Wind is part of wind, rather than funding ethanol that's produced using carbon capture and storage. We can get those two studies to you. He actually did two studies, one on direct air capture and one looking at the Summit pipeline and the costs of that. And by the way, Mark Jacobson points out that Summit no longer claims that their project will actually benefit the climate. So we're still in the middle of the Iowa Utility Board hearings on the Summit pipeline, and they've stopped claiming that this is going to benefit the climate. Their argument now is that purely the economics of it. My sixth point about why this is just a bad idea for climate is that pipelines themselves reduce the capacity of the land, that precious land's ability to sequester carbon. So we're destroying the land for the pipelines, and that reduces the ability of the soil, prairie, and forest to sequester CO2 in those natural biological processes. And I just want to point out that trees may not be planted on top of a pipeline. So I just happen to live in a county where we have Dakota Access going through, and we have a planned Summit CCS project on top of an ethanol plant, and the CO2 pipeline planned for this county. And the rules are that they cannot plant trees. The great gift of nature that takes in carbon dioxide and gives us the gift of oxygen, and we can't plant them on top of a pipeline. So we are destroying forest lands, especially along rivers, and other places that the savannas and the forests that pepper the tall grass prairie that I'm in. But certainly in Minnesota, trees are not allowed to be planted on top of that pipeline. So pipelines reduce the capacity of the land itself to sequester carbon. And my seventh point is CO2 pipelines leak. CO2 is it's notoriously leaky. We have some pretty good evidence about methane pipelines and recent studies, and every valve, the pump stations, all of it, CO2 pipelines are just leaky. And there are no requirements to track CO2 from cradle to grave. And so there's no way to actually know how much CO2 is lost between the collection point and the end point. And what I want to point out also, in addition to the collection point and the end point, is that the tax credit has no means built in to track the CO2. So the IRS doesn't require it, EPA doesn't require it, PHMSA doesn't currently require it. And that means that this is ripe for fraud. It's ripe for fraud on two fronts. One is the financial fraud. And we've already got evidence that 45Q has been a subject to fraud. Senator Menendez, of all people, got the Inspector General at the IRS to do a study and found quite a bit of money had been falsely claimed. So if you think it would have been falsely claimed when the 45Q tax credit was so much lower, wait till it's this much higher, especially because there's no requirement right now to track CO2 cradle to grave. We think that PHMSA could be required to track it. PHMSA is the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, and they are currently undergoing new rulemaking for CO2 pipelines because of the explosion at Satartia. And PHMSA itself is up for reauthorization. So we are hoping to get something in probably the reauthorization legislation that would require them to track this cradle to grave. And then it can be used by other agencies. But the point to take here is that they leak. And so that CO2 that's been generated, captured with that increased parasitic load, creating more greenhouse gases, putting it into pipelines that just naturally leak, is a bad climate idea. The eighth point that I would be making, and you'd see on my slides, is that it locks in the ethanol infrastructure. And so as states like California mandate moving away from fossil fuel vehicles, we lock in the ethanol infrastructure, and we lock in the carbon capture and sequestration or use infrastructure. And so we reduce the incentives for investors or policymakers to shift towards more sustainable transportation. And what we see in places like Iowa is that our Republican politicians are fighting every single policy and law that might move the nation away from ethanol and towards electric vehicles or public transportation. So we're locking in an infrastructure for decades that should be used for a rapid transition off of fossil fuels. Ninth, this is ethically, it's rotten because we are paying the polluter. The polluter gets more money the more they pollute. And so these incentives will drive more ethanol production and more CO2 generation so that the polluter gets more tax credits. I've done a lot of work on the precautionary principle. Some of you may know about that, which says you take action in the face of scientific uncertainty to prevent harm. And one of the elements for implementing the precautionary principle is that the polluter needs to pay. Otherwise, there's no process for protecting the Commonwealth, the things that we all share, if we are paying the polluter. And then my final point on why these are such a bad idea from a climate perspective is that it diverts both public and private money from real climate solutions. So the profits from ethanol, unlike, say, these harder to abate technologies like cement production or whatever else that they're claiming we have to do something about using carbon capture and storage, is that the profits from ethanol are so gigantic, and we are paying more for the more that they actually pollute. So the profits for an ethanol plant are just gigantic. And this will skew private investment, as we saw BlackRock, or maybe we didn't see it today, but as we've seen in the Navigator project, which got pulled, is that the amount of private money from BlackRock was huge. And that's because the profits from ethanol produced with carbon capture is just vast, much higher than with solar or wind. And what we see is the amount of public money that's going from both the low carbon fuel standard and the 45Q tax credits, that we are skewing the incentives for investment, both public and private, to fund carbon capture and storage rather than the real climate solutions. So, with that, I'm going to add that there are some additional problems with CO2 pipelines that have not been mentioned. One is that they explode, and the regulatory landscape, as I mentioned with PHMSA, we don't have adequate regulations for protecting public health and safety with CO2 pipelines, but we don't have protection for the waterways. And we talked about the aquifers with the breaches that Enbridge caused. And the problems of trenching and doing the drilling under our rivers to site these pipelines. And then the risks of a CO2 pipeline are so different than oil or gas. And that is because they can explode, they rupture. And for the project in the ADM project that was mentioned earlier in Illinois, they actually computed the danger of that kind of rupture and compared it to TNT. So they converted it to the explosion power of TNT. And this is huge. So imagine this going under the Mississippi River, which is what some of these are. Navigator was planned for going under the Mississippi, under the Missouri River, under any number of the waterways in Minnesota or Iowa. 1,800 river crossings for Navigator. And the Army Corps of Engineers has a brand new permit that they've never used before called the Nationwide Permit 58. And they haven't looked at the explosion rates and what that could do to the rivers, to dams, to levees. And if you think we've got problems already with Enbridge, with Dakota Access, with all of these pipelines, wait until you have a CO2 pipeline. So not only the climate, but all of the resources, not resources, all of these treasures, the rivers, the earth itself is at risk in a new way from these CO2 pipelines. And ethanol is the low-hanging fruit. We have to stop it. Thank you.